The bidding room went quiet the moment the auctioneer read out the lot number, and I knew something was wrong before he even said a word about the ship. My name is Marcus Bell, and I had spent 11 years buying and selling wrecked machines that nobody else wanted. Broken freighters, gutted mining rigs, burned out shuttles with their engines torn open like fruit. I knew the smell of a bad deal. I knew the silence that came before one too, and the silence in that auction hall, deep inside the trading station called Halcyon Drift, was the loudest silence I had ever heard. Every other lot that day had drawn some kind of noise, a cough, a whisper, a low murmur of interest from the rows of buyers sitting behind me, most of them not even human, their strange eyes flicking towards screens, showing spinning holograms of scrap metal. But when the image of the warship appeared above the stage, nobody moved. Nobody whispered. It was as if the whole room had stopped breathing at once. I looked up at the hologram floating above the stage. It was massive, longer than any vessel I had ever bid on, its hull dark and scarred, its shape somewhere between a blade and a closed fist. Old human lettering ran along one side, faded but still readable if you looked closely enough. The registry code glowed faintly at the bow, a string of numbers that meant nothing to me at the time. The auctioneer, a thin alien with silver skin and too many fingers, cleared his throat and repeated the starting price. It was almost nothing, less than what I had paid for a used cargo hauler 2 years earlier. I did the math in my head twice because I could not believe it. A ship that size, even gutted, even dead, should have been worth more than every other lot in that auction combined. Nobody raised a hand. I turned around in my seat to look at the crowd. Buyers who had been fighting over broken mining drones minutes earlier now sat with their arms folded, their eyes fixed anywhere except the stage. A few of them looked almost afraid. I remember thinking that was strange, because fear was not an emotion I associated with hardened salvage brokers. These were people who bought pieces of dead stars for a living. They did not scare easily. The auctioneer repeated the price a second time. Still nothing. I should have taken the silence as a warning. Looking back now, I understand that everyone else in that room understood something I did not. But at the time, all I saw was an opportunity. I was behind on payments for my dock space. My last 3 jobs had barely covered fuel. And here was a ship, an actual warship, being offered for less money than I had in my account that morning. I raised my hand. The auctioneer blinked at me, his too many fingers frozen for a moment above his control panel. He asked me to confirm the bid, which struck me as unusual, since nobody ever asked buyers to confirm anything at that auction. I confirmed it anyway. He asked a second time. I confirmed again, my voice a little sharper this time, annoyed at the delay. Nobody countered. The sale closed in under a minute. Just like that, I owned a ship larger than the trading station's own docking ring, and I had paid for it what most people would pay for a second-hand shuttle. I should have been thrilled. Instead, as I walked out of that auction hall, I noticed the way people looked at me. Not with envy, the way you would expect after someone won an unbelievable deal. They looked at me the way you look at someone who has just picked up something they should not have touched. A woman I vaguely recognized from previous auctions caught my arm before I reached the exit. Her name was Clara Bishop, another broker, someone I had exchanged a handful of words with over the years, but never called a friend. Her grip was tighter than it needed to be. She asked me if I understood what I had just bought. I told her I had bought a ship. A big one. The deal of a lifetime. She shook her head slowly, her eyes darting toward the exit, as if she wanted to say more, but was afraid of who might be listening. All she said was that some things sell cheap, because nobody wants to be the one holding them. Then she let go of my arm and walked away without another word, leaving me standing there with more questions than I had walked in with. I told myself she was being dramatic. Brokers were superstitious people. We dealt with wreckage every day, with machines that had outlived their crews, and it was easy to fall into strange habits of thought. I decided her warning meant nothing and pushed it out of my mind. The tow crew met me at the station's outer ring 3 hours later. Even from a distance, through the reinforced viewport of the tug that pulled it in, the ship looked different from its hologram. Bigger, heavier somehow, as though its mass alone bent the space around it. The tow crew, A rough group of dock workers who had hauled in wreckage of every size and shape worked in near total silence as they guided it into the empty berth reserved for oversized vessels. One of the workers, an older man with grey stubble and tired eyes, paused beside me as the ship settled into its clamps. He asked if I was the new owner. I said I was. He looked at me for a long moment, then told me that in 20 years of towing wrecks into this station, he had never felt a hull go cold the way that one did. He said it in a tone that was not meant to frighten me, just to inform me, the way you would tell someone that the weather was about to turn. I laughed it off at the time. I told him ships did not have temperatures that mattered once their reactors were offline. He shrugged and walked away, leaving me alone in the observation deck, staring through the viewport at the dark hull, now resting just outside the station. I stood there longer than I meant to. There was something about its shape that held my attention. It was not decorated the way most human vessels were, with insignias and unit markings and colorful stripes denoting allegiance. This ship was almost plain, its surface interrupted only by deep grooves running along its length, like scars that had healed wrong. And near the bow, faint under decades of dust and drifting debris, I could make out a symbol, a circle with a single line cutting through its center, worn down but still visible. I had never seen that symbol before, not on any human ship, in any auction I had ever attended, and I had attended hundreds. I made a note to look into it later, though at the time it felt like a minor curiosity rather than anything important. That night, back in my cramped quarters on the lower ring of the station, I pulled up every record I could find on the vessel using its registry code. Most of what came back was nothing. Empty database fields, missing maintenance logs, a gap in ownership history so wide it was almost suspicious, stretching back decades with no explanation. The only solid piece of information I found was a single line buried in an old shipping registry, listing the vessel's classification simply as retired, with no further detail given. Retired from what, the record did not say. I remember sitting at my desk that night, turning the registry code over in my mind, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and unease that I could not quite explain. Every instinct built up over a decade of salvage work told me that a ship this size, purchased for so little, with records this empty, was either the greatest deal I would ever make or the greatest mistake. I decided I would not know which one it was until I went inside. The next morning, I gathered a small crew of workers I trusted, mostly people I had hired for previous jobs, who knew how to move carefully through a dead ship without triggering whatever traps time and neglect tended to leave behind. There were 3 of them. Owen Hale, a broad-shouldered man who had cut his way into more wrecks than anyone else I knew. Grace Milton, sharp-eyed and quiet, who handled our scanning equipment better than anyone on the station. And a younger recruit named Victor Cade, eager to prove himself, carrying more confidence than experience. We approached the ship in a small transport pod, and even from a distance, its size was staggering. Up close, it swallowed the light around it, its dark hull absorbing the glow from the station's exterior lamps instead of reflecting it back. Grace ran her scanners over the surface as we approached, and I noticed her frown deepen with every pass. She told me the readings were strange, not broken, not powered down in the way most derelict ships were. Dormant, she said, choosing the word carefully, as if she were not entirely comfortable using it. She explained that the broken ship gave off no signal at all, a flat line of nothing. But this ship's internal systems showed faint pulses, evenly spaced, like something breathing slowly in its sleep. Owen made a joke about old machines settling as they cooled, trying to lighten the mood. Nobody laughed. We found an access hatch near the ship's underside, the metal around it scorched but intact. It took nearly 20 minutes to cut through the outer seal, the equipment straining against material far tougher than anything we had encountered before. When the hatch finally gave way, cold air rushed out past us, carrying with it a smell that was neither decay nor rust, but something closer to ozone, sharp and clean, as though the ship had only just been sealed, rather than left adrift for years. Inside, the corridors stretched out longer than our lights could reach, swallowed by darkness at both ends. The walls were smooth, unmarked by the kind of damage you would expect on a vessel this old. No exposed wiring, no broken panels, Everything looked, impossibly, intact. Grace's scanner beeped softly as we moved deeper inside, the pulse she had detected outside growing slightly stronger the further we went. Victor asked, in a voice that tried too hard to sound casual, whether we should turn back and report this to the station authorities before going any further. I told him we would keep moving. Every step deeper into that ship pulled at something in me I could not name, a mixture of curiosity and dread that refused to let me stop. We reached a junction where 4 corridors met, and for the first time since entering, all 4 of us stopped walking at the same moment, without needing to say why. Ahead of us, faint light bled out from beneath a sealed door, the only source of illumination we had seen since entering the ship that was not our own equipment. Owen raised his hand, signaling for quiet, though none of us had been talking. We stood there in the dim corridor, listening to nothing but our own breathing and the low hum of Grace's scanner, until a sound broke the silence that none of us expected. It was not a mechanical groan or the creak of settling metal. It was a voice, calm and even, speaking a single word that echoed down the corridor and settled into my chest like a stone dropped into still water. It said, "Welcome." None of us moved. None of us spoke. I remember staring at that sealed door, light bleeding out from beneath it, and understanding for the first time that whatever I had bought at that auction, it was not a wreck. It was something that had been waiting, and it had just noticed we were here. The 4 of us stood frozen at that junction for what felt like a full minute, though my chronometer later told me it had only been 11 seconds. Owen's hand rested on the grip of the cutting tool at his belt, not quite prepared to use it as a weapon, but not entirely convinced he would not need to. Victor's breathing had gone shallow and fast. Grace kept her scanner raised, its beam sweeping the corridor over and over, as though repetition alone might change what it was showing her. I asked, into the silence, who was speaking. The voice answered again, calm as before, with no trace of alarm at being addressed directly. It told me that voice recognition was still calibrating, and that it would require a moment to properly identify authorized personnel. It asked me to state my name. I hesitated before answering, some old instinct telling me that giving my name to a disembodied voice inside a derelict warship was not a wise decision, but curiosity, as it had done since the moment I first saw that hologram in the auction hall, won out over caution. I told it my name was Marcus Bell. There was a pause, longer this time, filled with a faint clicking sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the walls around us, as if unseen systems were shifting and reconfiguring themselves. Then the voice spoke again, and this time it addressed me directly by name, calling me a registered claimant, a term none of us understood. Grace lowered her scanner slightly and asked the obvious question. She asked what a registered claimant was. The voice explained, without hesitation, that ownership transfer had been recorded through station auction records, and that my name had automatically been logged as the vessel's current legal claimant under standing protocol. It said this the way you might explain a simple administrative process, as though the ship had been fully aware of the auction happening, fully aware of my bid, fully aware of everything that had transpired since I raised my hand in that quiet room the day before. I asked whether we were speaking to some kind of automated defense system. The voice said no. It identified itself, not by a name at first, but by a designation, a string of letters and numbers that meant nothing to any of us standing in that corridor. When I asked it to explain further, it told us, with a patience that felt almost unsettling in a machine, that full disclosure of its function required confirmation of claimant status, and that such confirmation could only occur inside the primary command chamber. Owen asked, in a voice that had lost some of its usual confidence, whether it was safe for us to proceed. The voice answered that no harm would come to registered personnel operating within standard parameters, though it added, almost as an afterthought, that it could not guarantee the same protection extended to those it had not yet identified. Victor's eyes went wide at that, and I noticed his hand drift toward the exit behind us, though he did not take a single step in that direction. I made the decision to continue forward. I told the others they could wait behind if they preferred, but none of them did. Whatever fear had settled into that corridor, curiosity had settled deeper, and none of us were willing to leave without understanding what we had found. The sealed door ahead of us slid open on its own as we approached, without any of us touching a control panel or issuing a command. Light spilled out into the corridor, warm and steady, nothing like the harsh white glow of our handheld lamps. Beyond the door lay a chamber unlike anything I had seen on any vessel before, human or otherwise. The room was circular, its walls lined with dormant screens that flickered faintly at the edges of my vision, as though only now beginning to wake after a long sleep. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, empty except for a single pedestal glowing with a soft blue light. The air inside felt different from the corridors we had passed through, warmer, cleaner, carrying that same faint scent of ozone we had noticed at the entrance, only stronger here. Grace's scanner let out a long, steady tone as she stepped through the doorway, and she told us, in a hushed voice, that every reading she had taken was now spiking far beyond anything she had recorded outside. She said the entire ship felt like it was coming back online, slowly, section by section, as though our presence itself had triggered some kind of gradual awakening. I walked toward the pedestal at the center of the room, my footsteps echoing off walls that seemed to absorb sound rather than reflect it. As I approached, the blue light pulsed once, brighter than before, and the voice spoke again, closer now, as though it were standing directly beside me, rather than emanating from speakers hidden somewhere in the walls. It asked me to place my hand upon the pedestal to complete identification. Owen told me not to do it. He said we knew nothing about this ship, nothing about what it wanted, and that placing my hand on an unknown device inside a vessel this old was reckless even by our standards, and our standards, he reminded me, were already considered reckless by most people in our line of work. He was right, and I knew it, but standing there in that chamber, surrounded by screens flickering back to life, after what felt like years of silence, I understood that I had already made my choice the moment I raised my hand in that auction hall. Whatever this ship was, whatever it wanted, I was already tied to it. Turning back now would only leave the question unanswered, and I had never been good at leaving questions unanswered. I placed my hand on the pedestal. The blue light flared, bright enough that all four of us shielded our eyes for a moment. When it faded, the screens along the walls lit up fully, one after another, displaying information in a script none of us could immediately read, dense and layered in a way that made our translators struggle to keep pace. Grace muttered something about the language being older than anything in her database, a variant of old human military code that predated the standardized systems used across current trade routes. The voice spoke once more, and this time, something in its tone had shifted, no longer cautious or measured, but steady with what almost sounded like relief. It confirmed my identity as the vessel's rightful claimant, and stated that primary systems would now begin full reactivation in accordance with standing orders. I asked what standing orders it was referring to. There was a pause before it answered, longer than any pause before it, as though the question itself required consideration beyond simple protocol. When it finally spoke, its answer left the four of us standing in silence once again, the same silence that had filled that auction hall the day before, except now I understood, at least in part, why nobody else in that room had dared to raise their hand. It told me that this vessel had never been abandoned. It told me it had been waiting. I asked the voice what exactly it had been waiting for, and for the first time since it had spoken to us, it did not answer right away. The screens along the curved walls continued to flicker with lines of dense old script, and somewhere beneath our feet I felt a faint vibration begin, low and steady, like a heartbeat starting after a long pause. Grace knelt down and pressed her palm flat against the floor, her scanner forgotten at her side for a moment. She said she could feel the vibration too, and that it was spreading, moving outward from the chamber we stood in toward the rest of the ship, as though whatever had been sleeping was now stretching itself awake, section by section, deck by deck. Owen asked the voice directly what was happening to the ship. It answered this time without hesitation, stating that primary reactor cores were beginning a slow, staged ignition sequence, designed to prevent structural stress after long-term dormancy. Wit assured us the process was gradual and controlled, and that no area of the ship currently occupied by us would be affected by the changes taking place elsewhere. Still, Victor took a step back toward the door, his eyes darting toward the corridor behind us, as though measuring how quickly he could retreat if the assurance turned out to be false. I asked the voice for its name, not its designation, not the string of letters and numbers it had given me earlier, but an actual name, the way you would ask a person to introduce themselves properly. There was another pause, shorter this time, and then it told me it had once been known simply as the Last Ember. It said the name slowly, almost carefully, as though it had not spoken it aloud in a very long time and wanted to make sure it still remembered how the words fit together. The name settled into the room in a way I did not expect. None of us said anything for a moment. There was something about the way it was spoken, quiet and deliberate, that made it feel less like a ship's registry name and more like something someone had once loved enough to give thought to. I asked why it had been called that. The Last Ember told me the full explanation of its name required access to records currently sealed under restricted clearance, and that such clearance could only be granted once identification protocols were fully completed. It suggested we continue toward the vessel's primary systems core, where remaining questions could be addressed directly. Grace, ever practical, asked how far the system's core was from our current position. The Last Ember answered that it was several decks below us, accessible through a central lift shaft that had not yet been reactivated. It offered to guide us there personally, its voice following us not through speakers we could see, but seemingly from the walls themselves, present in every corridor we passed through as though it existed everywhere at once inside its own body. We left the circular chamber and moved back into the corridor, our lamps now barely necessary, as more and more overhead lighting flickered on ahead of us, panel by panel, guiding our path forward, like a trail being lit specifically for our benefit. Owen commented quietly that he had worked on hundreds of derelict ships in his career, and none of them had ever behaved like this. Most dead ships stayed dead. This one felt like it was waking up around us, adjusting itself to our presence, learning our pace and matching it. As we walked, I noticed details I had missed on our way in, small alcoves built into the walls at intervals, each containing what looked like storage compartments sealed behind thick glass. Some were empty. Others held equipment I did not recognize, tools shaped for hands that were clearly human, but built with a precision and material quality far beyond anything currently manufactured on trade routes I was familiar with. Victor paused at one of these alcoves, studying a small device resting behind the glass, shaped vaguely like a handheld scanner, but far more compact. He asked the Last Ember what it was. It explained that the device was a diagnostic tool used by field engineers to assess hull integrity during active combat conditions, capable of scanning through several meters of solid material in under a second. Victor let out a low whistle, clearly impressed despite his earlier nervousness, and said that equipment like that would sell for more on the open market than the entire ship had cost me at auction. I reminded him we were not here to strip the ship for parts. He did not argue, but I noticed the way his eyes lingered on the alcove a moment longer before we continued walking. The corridor eventually opened into a wider space, some kind of gathering hall, its ceiling higher than anywhere else we had passed through. Long tables ran along one side, bolted to the floor, clearly designed for crew members to sit together during meals or briefings. Everything was untouched, as though whoever had last used this room had simply stepped out for a moment, rather than leaving it decades ago. I asked the Last Ember how long it had been sitting dormant before we arrived. It told me, without hesitation, that its last recorded activity, prior to our boarding, had occurred 62 years earlier. The number hit harder than I expected. 62 years of silence, 62 years of drifting through whatever region of space had eventually brought it to that auction. And yet everything around us looked as though it had been maintained daily. No dust, no decay, no sign of the slow rot that consumed every other derelict ship I had ever set foot on. Grace asked how that was possible, given the ship's age and the length of time it had been inactive. The Last Ember explained that internal preservation systems had remained active throughout the dormancy period, maintaining atmosphere, temperature, and structural integrity at minimal power draw, specifically designed to keep the vessel intact for an extended, unspecified length of time. When Grace asked what that preservation system had been designed to protect, the last ember did not answer immediately. Instead, it asked us to continue toward the system's core, repeating the request with a gentleness that felt almost deliberate, as though it wanted to delay the answer until we had seen more for ourselves. We reached the lift shaft the last ember had mentioned, its doors sealed but humming faintly with restored power. They slid open as we approached, revealing a compartment large enough to hold all four of us with room to spare, its interior lined with the same smooth, unmarked material as the rest of the ship. Once inside, the doors closed on their own, and the lift began a slow descent, smoother and quieter than any elevator I had used on any station or vessel in my life. Victor broke the silence during the descent by asking a question that had clearly been building in him since we first heard the last ember speak. He asked why a ship this advanced, this well-maintained, this obviously valuable, had been sold at auction for almost nothing, with no other bidders even attempting to compete. I had been wondering the same thing myself, though I had not found the courage to ask it directly. The last ember answered without hesitation, and its answer explained more about the reaction we had witnessed in that auction hall than anything else it had told us so far. It said that vessels of its class carried a designation recognized across most spacefaring civilizations, a designation that triggered automatic avoidance protocols in nearly every commercial database in known space. It explained that most buyers who encountered its registry code would have received an immediate warning through their translator systems, informing them of the classification before they ever considered raising a bid. I asked why my own translator had shown no such warning. There was a brief pause, and then the last ember explained that my translator model, an older unit I had purchased second-hand years earlier, likely lacked the updated database required to recognize the classification. In simpler terms, I had gotten lucky, or perhaps unlucky, depending on how the rest of this story unfolded. My hardware was too outdated to warn me away from the one purchase every other buyer in that room had been silently terrified of making. Grace let out a short, disbelieving laugh at that, though there was no real humor in it. She said that in 11 years of salvage work, this was the first time cheap equipment had actually worked in our favor. I asked the last ember what classification it was referring to. It told me that full disclosure of that information was scheduled to occur once we reached the system's core, now only moments away. I felt a tightness form in my chest at the mention of it, a mixture of anticipation and something closer to dread, the same feeling that had followed me since the moment Clara Bishop grabbed my arm outside the auction hall and warned me, without ever quite saying it directly, that I had bought something I did not understand. The lift came to a gentle stop, and its doors opened onto a chamber far larger than anything we had passed through so far. Rows of dormant consoles stretched out before us, arranged in careful formation around a central column that rose from floor to ceiling, pulsing faintly with the same blue light we had seen in the identification chamber above. The air here was colder, sharper, carrying a faint electric charge that made the hair on my arms stand up the moment we stepped inside. Owen moved toward the nearest console, running his hand along its surface, careful not to press anything. He said the design reminded him of old military architecture he had studied years earlier, back when he had briefly considered a career in engineering before drifting into salvage work instead. He said the layout suggested this was not simply a command room, but something closer to a coordination hub, designed to manage far more than a single vessel's systems. I asked the last ember to confirm what this chamber was used for. It answered plainly, without any hesitation this time, stating that this chamber had once served as a coordination point for fleet-level operations during an extended period of conflict, allowing this vessel to communicate directly with a wider network of similarly designed ships operating across multiple sectors simultaneously. Victor asked how many ships had been part of that network. The last ember told him the original number had been considerable, though it added, after a brief pause, that it currently held no record of any other vessel from that network remaining active. As far as its own systems could determine, it was the last of its kind still capable of independent operation. The weight of that statement settled over the room in a way that none of us addressed out loud. I thought back to the name it had given itself, spoken so carefully in that upper chamber. The Last Ember. It was not simply a name chosen for its sound. It was a description, plain and literal, of exactly what this ship believed itself to be. I asked what had happened to the rest of the network. The Last Ember told me that answering that question fully would require access to records currently restricted under Standing Protocol, protocols that remained in place until full claimant authorization was granted through direct verification at this chamber's central column. Grace asked what that verification process involved. Before the Last Ember could answer, the central column pulsed brighter, and a section of the floor beneath it slid open with a soft mechanical hiss, revealing a narrow platform rising slowly upward from some hidden compartment below. Resting on that platform was a small, sealed case, its surface etched with the same symbol I had noticed on the ship's hull earlier that day, the circle with a single line cutting through its center. The Last Ember explained that the case contained credentials belonging to the vessel's original commanding officer, credentials that had been sealed away specifically for the moment a new claimant would eventually take possession of the ship. It said that opening the case would grant me full access to every restricted record currently held within its systems, including the answer to Victor's earlier question about the fate of the wider network, and the true reason this vessel had been left drifting for 62 years instead of being destroyed outright. I stood there staring at that case for a long moment, aware of the others watching me, waiting to see what I would do. Everything about that day, from the silence in the auction hall, to the warning from Clara Bishop, to the voice that had greeted us in the darkness, had led toward this single decision. I reached out and opened the case. The case opened with a quiet click, and a thin beam of light rose from within it, folding itself into the shape of a woman standing just a few feet in front of me. She wore a uniform I did not recognize, dark gray with a single insignia over the chest, the same circle and line symbol I had seen on the hull and etched into the case itself. Her expression was calm, composed in the way of someone who had recorded this message, knowing it might be watched by a stranger, many years after her own time had passed. She introduced herself as Elena Voss, commanding officer of the vessel now standing before us. Her voice carried no warmth, but no coldness either, only a steady clarity that made it clear every word had been chosen with care, long before it was ever spoken. She said that if this recording was playing, it meant ownership of the ship had passed to someone outside the original chain of command, and that whoever stood listening now had been granted claimant status under the vessel's standing protocols. She said this was not something she had wanted, but something she had prepared for, because even the strongest hope for peace required a plan for the day peace no longer held. Grace, Owen, and Victor stood in silence behind me, watching the recording with the same stunned attention I felt myself. None of us interrupted. Elena Voss explained that the vessel belonged to a classification known as an Ember-class Sentinel, one of a small number of ships constructed during the final years of a conflict she referred to only as the Long War, a conflict that had stretched across dozens of systems and drawn in species from every corner of known space. She did not go into detail about how the war began. She said only that by its final years, it had grown so severe that entire fleets were being lost faster than they could be replaced, and that a small group of engineers and commanders had proposed something drastic in response. She explained that instead of building more ships to fight the war as it stood, they built a handful of vessels designed to end it outright. Ships capable of striking decisively enough that continuing the conflict would no longer be possible for those responsible for prolonging it. She said the Ember-class Sentinels were built for exactly one purpose, and that purpose had been achieved. I asked, though I knew the recording could not hear me, what exactly that purpose had looked like in practice. As if sensing the question anyway, Elena Voss continued, her tone unchanged, explaining that the war had ended not because one side destroyed the other, but because the side prolonging the conflict finally understood that continuing came at a cost they were no longer willing to pay. She said the Sentinels had been the reason that understanding arrived as quickly as it did. Owen let out a slow breath beside me, and I heard Victor shift uneasily on his feet. Elena Voss went on to explain that once the war ended, the Sentinels became a problem nobody quite knew how to solve. Destroying them outright would have wasted resources and technology that had taken years to develop. Keeping them in active service risked unsettling the fragile new peace treaties being signed between former enemies who remained deeply suspicious of any lingering human military presence. The compromise, she said, had been quiet retirement, not decommissioning, not destruction, simply a slow drift into dormancy, far from established trade routes, with orders to remain inactive unless specific conditions were met. I asked, again knowing the recording could not answer directly, what those conditions were. As though anticipating the question long before I ever asked it, Elena Voss explained that reactivation could occur under one of two circumstances. The first was a formal recall issued by remaining human command authority, a recall she noted had never come, and likely never would, given how much time had passed, and how thoroughly human military structures had changed since the war's end. The second circumstance was far simpler. Reactivation would occur automatically the moment a new claimant took possession of the vessel through any legitimate transfer of ownership, including, she said, with what almost sounded like dry acknowledgement, a public auction. The four of us stood in silence as the weight of that statement settled over the chamber. I had not simply purchased a derelict warship. I had triggered a dormant protocol written decades earlier by people who had anticipated this exact scenario, people who had built in a fail-safe specifically for the possibility that one day, someone unconnected to any military chain of command would stumble into ownership of a vessel like this one. Elena Voss's recorded image continued, and her next words struck harder than anything she had said so far. She explained that the ship had not been left empty. A portion of the original crew, herself included, remained aboard, held in long-term stasis, rather than being reassigned or discharged after the war's end. She said this had been her own decision, made with the agreement of those under her command, motivated by a simple belief that if the peace they had fought for ever truly failed, someone loyal to the ship's original purpose should be available to answer the recall, rather than leaving such a vessel to fall into unfamiliar hands. Grace asked, her voice barely above a whisper, how many crew members that meant were currently aboard. Before the recording could answer, or perhaps because it had never been designed to answer questions asked aloud in the room, rather than embedded in its original script, the chamber around us shuddered, a deep vibration passing through the floor beneath our feet, stronger than anything we had felt since boarding. The last ember spoke immediately, its voice cutting through the moment with unmistakable urgency, informing us that full reactor ignition had just completed successfully, and that as a direct consequence, standard operating protocols required it to broadcast an activation signal, identifying itself to any registered network still listening across known space. I asked what that meant in practical terms. The last ember explained, its tone measured but carrying an edge I had not heard from it before, that any surviving records of the Ember-class Sentinel program, wherever they might exist, whether held by human successor governments or by other civilizations who had catalogued the ships during the war, would now be alerted to the fact that one of them had returned to active status after 62 years of silence. Owen asked whether that was dangerous. The last ember did not answer immediately, and in the silence that followed, Elena Voss's holographic image flickered once, her expression unreadable as her recorded message reached its final lines. She said, almost as though speaking directly to whoever stood listening in that moment, that the peace her generation had fought so hard to secure was never guaranteed to last forever, and that if this recording was being viewed because the ship had been reactivated by someone outside the chain of command, then whoever that person was should understand clearly that the galaxy remembered the Sentinels far better than most humans ever would. Her image faded, folding back into light and vanishing into the case from which it had risen. The chamber fell silent except for the low hum of newly restored power flowing through the walls around us. I stood there, staring at the empty space where her hologram had stood, trying to process everything she had told us. A war ended not through mutual exhaustion, but through decisive, deliberate force. A classification of ship still remembered, still feared, decades after the fighting stopped. A crew, my crew now apparently, sealed away somewhere deeper inside this vessel, waiting for a recall that had just been triggered the moment I raised my hand in an auction hall I had walked into looking for nothing more than a good deal. Victor broke the silence first, asking the question that had clearly been building in all of us since the recording began. He asked what would happen now that the activation signal had gone out. The last ember answered plainly, without any attempt to soften the truth of what it was telling us. It said that within a matter of days, possibly hours, every party across known space with any memory of what an Ember-class Sentinel represented would know exactly where to find us. We left the ship that evening, though leaving did not feel like the right word for it. It felt more like stepping back from the edge of something enormous, something that had only just begun to reveal its shape to us, and needing distance before we could think clearly again. The last ember allowed us to depart without objection, though as we passed through the outer hatch, it reminded me, in that same calm voice, that I remained its registered claimant, and that it would continue monitoring for further instructions whenever I chose to return. Back aboard the station, the four of us sat together in a cramped dockside lounge that smelled of recycled air and old fuel, none of us quite ready to speak about what we had just experienced. Victor ordered a drink he barely touched. Grace kept checking her scanner readings from earlier, scrolling through them again and again, as though searching for some detail she might have missed the first time. Owen stared at the table in front of him, his jaw tight, saying nothing at all. I was the one who finally broke the silence, telling them I needed to understand exactly what an Ember-class Sentinel was, and what kind of war required building something like it. None of them argued. I think all of us needed the same answer, and none of us were foolish enough to believe we would sleep easily until we had it. I remembered an old contact of mine, a human information dealer named Elias Marsh, who had spent decades collecting records other people wanted forgotten. He ran a small archive 2 decks below the main trading floor, cluttered with old data crystals and salvaged terminals that most people assumed were junk. I had done business with him before, mostly small favors traded for small pieces of information, nothing as significant as what I needed from him now. We found him exactly where he always was, hunched over a workbench covered in disassembled hardware, his silver hair catching the dim light of the archive's flickering overhead lamps. He looked up when we entered, and something in his expression shifted the moment he recognized me. Not surprise exactly. More like he had been expecting this visit for longer than I would have guessed. I told him what had happened at the auction, and what we had found aboard the ship. I gave him the classification the last ember had used to describe itself, watching his face carefully as I spoke the words aloud for the first time outside that dormant chamber deep within the vessel. Elias set down the tool he had been holding and asked me to repeat the classification, slower this time, as though he wanted to be certain he had heard correctly. When I repeated it, he let out a long breath and rubbed a hand across his face, the way people do when confirming something they had hoped was not true. He told us that stories about the Ember-class Sentinels had circulated through information networks for decades, though most people who heard them assumed they were exaggerated, the kind of tale traders swapped over drinks to make a war sound more dramatic than it actually was. He said very few people still living had first-hand knowledge of what those ships had actually done, and fewer still were willing to discuss it openly. Grace asked him directly what they had done. Elias considered the question for a long moment before answering. He explained that the war Elena Voss's recording had referred to, the one historians outside human circles sometimes called the Long War, had involved a coalition of several major species locked in a conflict over territory and resources that had dragged on for nearly a generation. Humanity had entered that conflict relatively late, and initially badly outmatched. He said most independent historians agreed the war would have ended in humanity's defeat within a few more years, had a small group of engineers not proposed something that changed the balance entirely. He told us that the Sentinels were not simply warships, they were instruments of decisive resolution, built and deployed with the explicit purpose of ending key conflicts fast enough that continued resistance became strategically pointless for those responsible for prolonging them. He would not describe the details of how they accomplished this, and when Victor pressed him for specifics, Elias shook his head firmly and told him some information was better left where it had settled. I asked him why nobody at the auction had been willing to bid on the ship, given how much time had passed since the war's end. Elias explained that fear does not always fade evenly across generations. He said that many species who had fought in that coalition against humanity still passed down warnings about the Sentinels, the way old sailors once passed down warnings about storms, not because every young trader had witnessed one firsthand, but because the stories carried enough weight that caution simply became instinct. A ship carrying that classification appearing in any auction catalog, he said, would trigger the same reaction in most buyers that a known hazard warning would trigger in any reasonable person. You did not question it, you simply stayed away. Owen asked what would happen now that the ship had broadcast an activation signal identifying itself. Elias's expression tightened at that question, and for the first time since we arrived, he looked genuinely concerned rather than simply resigned. He told us that if the ship had truly announced its return to any surviving network, we should expect attention from multiple directions, and not all of it would be friendly. He explained that certain factions, particularly among species who remembered the war most vividly, viewed any reactivated Sentinel as an unacceptable risk, regardless of who currently claimed ownership. He said others, less concerned with the ship's history and more interested in its capability, would see an opportunity worth pursuing by whatever means necessary. I asked him directly whether that meant we were in danger. He did not answer right away. Instead, he reached beneath his workbench and retrieved an old data terminal, its casing scratched and worn from years of use. He connected it to a small display and pulled up a network feed I did not recognize, showing chatter scraped from unregulated communication channels across several nearby systems. He turned the display toward us, and I saw dozens of messages scrolling past, all referencing the same activation signal, all written in a mixture of languages my translator struggled to fully render, but the tone of urgency came through clearly regardless of the words used. Grace leaned closer to the screen, scanning the messages as they scrolled past. She said the volume of chatter alone told her this was already spreading faster than any of us had expected, barely hours after the signal first went out. Elias confirmed her assessment grimly. He told us that word of a reactivated Ember-class Sentinel would not stay contained to quiet trading channels for long. He said within a day, perhaps 2 at most, we should expect actual arrivals at Halcyon Drift itself, drawn by a signal that most of the galaxy had hoped never to hear again. I asked him what he would do if he were in my position. He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before finally answering that he honestly did not know, and that in all his years collecting information about the war and everything that followed it, he had never once considered what he would do if he found himself standing where I now stood, holding legal claim to something the rest of the galaxy still feared, decades after it had gone silent. We left his archive with more questions than we had arrived with, though at least now those questions had shape and context behind them. As we made our way back toward the main trading floor, Victor asked quietly whether I intended to keep the ship, given everything we had just learned. I told him I did not know yet. That answer felt honest at the time, though as we crossed through the station's central concourse, passing beneath the wide viewport that looked out toward the dock where the last ember rested silently against the dark of open space, I noticed something that made the question feel far less theoretical than it had a moment earlier. Several unfamiliar vessels had appeared in the surrounding space since we had entered the station that morning, their running lights visible even at a distance, arranged in loose formation near the outer edge of the docking ring. None of them displayed identification markings I recognized from any registered trade fleet or independent carrier group operating in this region. Grace noticed them at the same moment I did, her steps slowing as she followed my gaze toward the viewport. She asked quietly whether those ships had been there earlier that morning when we first boarded. I told her they had not. Owen came to a stop beside us, his jaw tightening as he studied the distant formation. He said, in a voice low enough that only the 4 of us could hear, that whatever those ships were, they had arrived faster than anyone should have been able to respond to a signal broadcast only hours earlier, which meant either luck had brought them here at exactly the wrong moment, or somebody out there had already been watching for exactly this kind of signal long before we ever raised our hands in that auction hall. None of us had an answer for which possibility frightened us more. We returned to the ship within the hour, deciding that whatever answers we still needed, they would be found faster aboard the last ember than anywhere else on the station. The unfamiliar vessels remained at a distance, holding their position near the outer docking ring, making no attempt to approach or communicate. Still, their presence sat with me the entire way back. A quiet weight settled behind my thoughts that refused to lift. The last ember greeted us as we boarded, its voice steady as always, though it informed me immediately that it had detected the same unregistered vessels we had observed from the station, and that it was tracking their movements continuously as a precaution. I asked whether it considered them an immediate threat. It answered that their current behavior did not match any known attack pattern, but that their arrival timeline was, in its own words, statistically improbable given the short window since activation, and that continued caution was advised. I told it I wanted to see the crew Elena Voss had mentioned in her recording. I had been turning that detail over in my mind since we left the systems core, unable to shake the thought of actual people, real human beings, sealed away somewhere inside this ship for 62 years, waiting on a recall none of them could have known would eventually come through something as ordinary as an auction. The last ember did not hesitate before answering. It told me that access to the stasis deck had been unlocked automatically the moment I completed claimant verification through the case in the system's core, and that it would guide us there directly if I wished to proceed. Grace asked whether waking the crew was something we should attempt, given how little we understood about the process, or about the people themselves. Owen agreed, pointing out that people who had been sealed away for 62 years, still operating under orders from a war most of the galaxy had spent decades trying to forget, might not react well to finding themselves suddenly thawed out into a world that had moved on entirely without them. I told them I understood the risk, but that leaving those questions unanswered no longer felt like an option, not after everything Elena Voss's recording had told us, and not with unfamiliar ships already gathering outside. We followed the Lost Ember's guidance through a series of corridors deeper into the ship than we had traveled before, the air growing steadily colder the further we descended. Eventually we reached a wide chamber lined with rows of sealed pods, each one built into the wall in neat, evenly spaced columns, faint light glowing from small panels set into their surfaces. There were more pods than I had expected, stretching along both sides of the chamber, further than our lamps could fully illuminate. I asked the last ember how many crew members remained in stasis. It answered that the total number currently sealed within this deck was 41, though it clarified that not all 41 were part of the original combat crew. Several, it explained, were support personnel, engineers, and medical staff who had chosen to remain aboard alongside their commanding officer rather than accept reassignment after the war's end. Victor asked quietly whether waking even one of them carried any risk to the rest of us. The Lost Ember explained that stasis revival was a controlled process requiring gradual adjustment, and that it recommended reviving only the designated commanding officer first, both out of protocol and out of practical necessity, since Elena Voss herself had left standing instructions that any reactivation event should begin with her own revival before proceeding further. I gave the order to proceed. The pod nearest the center of the chamber began to hum softly, its internal light shifting from a dim blue to a warmer amber glow. Frost that had clung to its surface began to melt away in slow, uneven patches, revealing the shape of a woman inside, still and pale, her features matching the hologram we had seen hours earlier, though far more fragile in appearance than the confident recorded image had suggested. The process took nearly 20 minutes, during which none of us spoke, watching in near silence as the pod systems worked through what the Last Ember described as a careful thermal and biological restoration sequence. When the seal finally released with a soft hiss, the front panel sliding open, Elena Voss drew a slow, ragged breath, her eyes fluttering open for the first time in 62 years. She did not panic, which surprised me more than almost anything else that had happened that day. Instead, she remained still for several long moments, her breathing steadying gradually, her eyes moving carefully across the chamber, taking in every detail before finally settling on me. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse but clear, carrying the same measured tone we had heard in her recording. She asked how long it had been. I told her 62 years. She absorbed that number without visible shock, though something behind her eyes shifted, a quiet acknowledgement of loss, too large to process all at once. She asked whether the peace treaties from the war's end had held. I told her, as far as I understood, they largely had, though tensions between certain species remained. She nodded slowly, as though this answer confirmed something she had long suspected might be the case, that peace, once achieved, rarely stayed perfectly intact, but rarely collapsed entirely either. She asked for my name next, and I gave it, along with a brief explanation of how I had come to be standing in front of her, the auction, the empty bidding room, the silence I still did not fully understand until Elias Marsh had explained it to us hours earlier. When I finished, Elena Voss was quiet for a long moment, studying me with an expression I could not fully read. Then she said something that stayed with me long after that conversation ended. She told me that of all the ways she had imagined this moment unfolding over the years before entering stasis, a scavenger buying the ship for nearly nothing at a public auction because his equipment was too outdated to recognize the danger, had never once crossed her mind, and that she found a strange kind of relief in that fact, because it meant the peace her generation had fought for had lasted long enough for people like me to exist, people who no longer instinctively feared the sight of a ship like this one. I asked her what she intended to do now that she was awake. She told me her first priority would always be the safety of the crew still sealed in stasis around us, and that any decision about the ship's future needed to account for their well-being above all else. She asked whether I intended to hand the vessel over to some governing authority, sell it for scrap, or attempt to operate it myself. I told her honestly that I had not yet decided, that everything about this day had moved faster than I could properly process, and that the appearance of unfamiliar ships gathering just outside the station made the question feel more urgent than it had that morning. Her expression sharpened at the mention of unfamiliar vessels, and she asked immediately for details, her voice carrying an edge of authority that made it easy, even after 62 years of silence, to understand exactly how she had once commanded a ship like this one during an actual war. Grace pulled up the readings from her scanner, showing what limited information we had gathered about the formation outside. Elena Voss studied the display carefully, her expression growing more focused with each passing second, until finally she looked up at me and asked a question that made the weight I had been carrying since the auction settle even heavier across my shoulders. She asked whether I understood that the arrival of ships this quickly after an activation signal meant someone out there had almost certainly been monitoring for exactly this possibility long before today, which raised the uncomfortable likelihood that whatever was gathering outside the station had not come here by chance, but had been waiting, much like the ship itself had been waiting, for the day an Ember-class Sentinel finally woke up again. The station's communication channels lit up within the hour, a formal request routed directly to my personal account, something that had never happened to me before, in all my years as a broker. Most of my communications came through informal trade boards or word passed between contacts. A direct, encrypted request routed through official station channels meant whoever was sending it had resources and standing that ordinary traders simply did not possess. The message identified the sender only by a formal title, a representative speaking on behalf of a coalition of interested parties, requesting an in-person meeting aboard the station to discuss what they described as a matter of shared regional concern. No further details were given, though the timing left little doubt about what that matter actually was. Elena Voss, still adjusting to consciousness after 62 years of stasis, insisted on being present for any meeting that involved the ship's future. I argued that she needed time to recover properly, but she waved off the concern with the same steady authority she had carried since the moment she first opened her eyes. She told me that whoever was requesting this meeting had likely already assumed the ship's original crew remained fully in stasis, and that her presence, awake and alert, might shift the balance of that conversation more than anything I could say alone. We agreed to meet in a neutral conference room near the station's central administrative ring, a small, undecorated space typically reserved for trade disputes rather than matters of this scale. Owen and Victor remained aboard the Lost Ember, monitoring the unfamiliar vessels still holding position outside, while Grace accompanied Elena Voss and me to the meeting itself, her scanner tucked discreetly beneath her jacket in case we needed real-time readings of anything unusual. The representative who arrived to meet us was not what I expected. I had pictured, based on Elias Marsh's warnings, some hardened military figure prepared to issue threats or demands. Instead, we were met by a tall, silver-skinned diplomat named Krev Oss, accompanied by two quiet aides, who said nothing throughout the entire meeting, their attention fixed carefully on Elena Voss, rather than on me. Krev Oss greeted us with careful formality, acknowledging both of us by name, which told me immediately that whatever intelligence network had picked up the activation signal had also gathered detailed information about who was currently aboard the ship. He explained that he represented a coalition of species who had participated, directly or indirectly, in the war Elena Voss's ship had helped bring to its end. He said the coalition's interest in this matter was not hostile, though his careful choice of words made it clear that hostility remained a possibility, depending on how this conversation unfolded. Elena Voss spoke first, her voice steady despite everything her body had endured over the past several hours. She asked Krev Oss directly what outcome his coalition hoped to achieve by gathering ships outside a civilian trading station, rather than simply reaching out through diplomatic channels. Krev Oss answered carefully, explaining that his coalition had learned of the activation signal within minutes of its broadcast, and that given the history associated with vessels of this classification, an immediate and visible response had been considered necessary to prevent any misunderstanding about the coalition's awareness of the situation. He assured us the ships currently positioned outside the station carried no offensive intention, provided the matter could be resolved through discussion rather than escalation. I asked him plainly what resolution his coalition was actually hoping for. He answered without hesitation this time, stating that his coalition would strongly prefer the vessel be permanently decommissioned, its systems fully shut down under joint observation, in order to formally close what he described as an unresolved chapter of the long war that many species had spent decades trying to move past. Elena Voss's expression did not change, though I noticed her hands tighten slightly where they rested on the table between us. She asked Krev Oss whether his coalition understood that permanently decommissioning a vessel with a crew still aboard, people who had made their own choice to remain loyal to their original orders rather than accept discharge, amounted to asking those individuals to simply disappear from existence in service of erasing an uncomfortable memory. Krev Oss shifted slightly at that framing, and for the first time since the meeting began, his composed diplomatic tone wavered. He said his coalition had not fully considered that the original crew might still be alive, rather than simply archived within the ship's systems as historical record. Grace spoke up at that point, her voice quiet but firm, pointing out that the crew were very much alive, and very much aware of everything happening around them, and that any decision made in this room needed to account for the fact that real people, not abstract historical symbols, were the ones whose future was actually being discussed. Krev Oss fell silent for a long moment, clearly recalculating something in his approach. When he finally spoke again, his tone had shifted, less certain than before, and he asked whether an alternative arrangement might be possible, one that addressed his coalition's concerns without requiring the outcome he had originally proposed. I told him I was willing to discuss alternatives, provided any arrangement respected both the safety of the crew still aboard and my own legal claim over the vessel, a claim that had been recognized under the very protocols his coalition itself seemed to take seriously enough to send ships in response to. The conversation that followed stretched on for nearly 2 hours, moving through proposals and counter-proposals, each side testing the boundaries of what the other might accept. Krev Oss suggested full disarmament of the vessel's offensive systems under coalition observation, a compromise Elena Voss initially resisted, arguing that a fully disarmed Sentinel would leave its remaining crew defenseless against exactly the kind of opportunistic threats Elias Marsh had warned us about earlier that day. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, taking on the role of mediator between the two positions, drawing on skills I had spent years developing during difficult negotiations over salvage rights and disputed cargo claims, though nothing in my career had prepared me for negotiations of this scale or consequence. Eventually, we reached a fragile arrangement. The lost ember would remain under my legal claim, its crew permitted to remain aboard, and gradually revived at their own discretion, while its most significant offensive capabilities would be voluntarily restricted under a monitoring agreement overseen jointly by Krev Oss's coalition and, at Elena Voss's insistence, a small independent human observer group to ensure the arrangement was not simply a means of leaving the ship defenseless. Krev Oss agreed to bring this proposal back to his coalition for formal consideration, though he warned us plainly that not every member of that coalition shared his own cautious optimism about resolving this peacefully. He said some factions represented within the gathered ships outside believed no compromise was acceptable, and that they viewed any reactivated Sentinel, regardless of restrictions placed upon it, as a threat that should be eliminated outright rather than negotiated with. As the meeting drew to a close, Krev Oss's expression grew serious in a way it had not been throughout the earlier, more formal portions of our conversation. He told us quietly, almost as a private warning rather than an official statement, that we should expect at least one faction among the gathered ships to reject whatever agreement his coalition ultimately proposed, and that we would be wise to prepare for the possibility that words alone might not be enough to settle this matter. Elena Voss thanked him for his honesty, and as we left that conference room, I could see in her expression the same calculation she must have carried through every difficult decision during the war she had once fought in, a quiet, focused readiness for whatever came next, regardless of how uncertain that outcome remained. We returned to the Lost Ember as evening settled over the station, the unfamiliar ships still holding their position outside, their numbers, I noticed with a tightening in my chest, having grown by 3 additional vessels since we had left for the meeting only hours earlier. Word came through just after midnight station time, delivered directly to the Lost Ember's communication array rather than through any official channel. Krev Oss's voice carried none of its earlier diplomatic polish, replaced instead by a tension that told me exactly what had happened before he finished a single sentence. He informed us that his coalition had been unable to reach unanimous agreement on the proposal we had discussed that afternoon, and that one faction, representing several of the ships currently gathered outside the station, had formally rejected any arrangement that allowed the vessel to remain active under any conditions whatsoever. He told us this faction intended to act independently of the broader coalition's wishes, and that he no longer held authority to guarantee their restraint. His final words before ending the transmission were a quiet apology, offered not as an official representative, but as someone who genuinely seemed to regret how quickly diplomacy had reached its limits. Elena Voss received this news standing at the center of the systems core, surrounded by consoles that had fully reactivated over the past several hours as more of the ship's original functions came back online. She absorbed the warning without visible alarm, the same steady composure she had carried since the moment she first woke, though I noticed her attention sharpen immediately toward the tactical displays now glowing along the chamber's curved walls. I asked her what our options were. She explained that the Lost Ember, even operating with only a fraction of its original crew, revived, and its most significant systems, still restricted under the very monitoring agreement we had proposed earlier that day, remained fully capable of defending itself against conventional threats. She said the real danger was not whether the ship could withstand an attack, but whether allowing that attack to happen at all would undo whatever fragile trust had been built during our negotiations with the more reasonable members of Krev Oss's coalition. Grace asked whether we should simply undock and retreat from the station entirely, removing the immediate danger to Halcyon Drift and its civilian population. Elena Voss considered this carefully before answering, explaining that abandoning the station now, mid-crisis, might be read by observers as confirmation of exactly the aggressive, unpredictable behavior the coalition's more fearful faction already expected from a reactivated Sentinel. She said that whatever choice we made in the next few hours would likely shape how every remaining witness across known space understood not just this ship, but humanity's intentions going forward. I told her the decision, ultimately, belonged to her far more than it belonged to me, given everything she had built her life around long before I ever existed. She shook her head at that, telling me plainly that legal claim over the vessel rested with me, whether either of us fully wanted that responsibility or not, and that the choice of how to proceed needed to be one we made together, not one she simply handed down from decades of experience I did not share. We spent the next hour reviewing every option available to us, weighing the risk of confrontation against the risk of retreat, until finally settling on an approach neither purely defensive nor aggressive. Elena Voss proposed opening a direct, unencrypted broadcast to every vessel currently gathered outside the station, faction included, rather than continuing to negotiate quietly through Krev Os alone. She said that transparency, offered voluntarily rather than extracted through threat, might accomplish what quiet diplomacy alone could not. I agreed, and the last ember opened the channel. Elena Voss spoke directly into that broadcast, her voice steady and clear, addressing every ship listening without hesitation or apology. She acknowledged openly what the Sentinels had once been built to accomplish, and she did not attempt to minimize the fear that history had left behind across the species who had lived through that war. She said she understood that fear intimately, having carried the weight of what her own service required of her for every day since the war's end, a weight she said she would carry for the rest of her life, regardless of what happened aboard this station tonight. But she said something else as well, something that shifted the tone of that broadcast into territory I had not expected. She said the true lesson of the long war was never meant to be a story about a weapon so powerful that no one could safely stand against it. She said the actual lesson, the one she hoped every generation since had carried forward, was that even a weapon capable of ending a war outright had ultimately chosen restraint the moment restraint became possible. She reminded every listener that the Sentinels had gone silent the very day peace became achievable, not because they were ordered to stand down under threat of force, but because standing down was the entire point of everything they had been built to accomplish in the first place. She told them that this ship had spent 62 years asleep specifically because peace had held, and that its reactivation tonight was not a declaration of renewed conflict, but simply the accidental consequence of an old protocol meeting an unexpected new claimant. She said the true nightmare the galaxy remembered was never simply human capability. It was human resolve, the willingness to build something devastating and then, having achieved its purpose, choose quiet restraint over continued dominance, a choice she said very few other civilizations throughout that long war had ever demonstrated themselves. Silence followed her broadcast for several long minutes, stretching across every channel the last ember monitored. Then, one by one, the unfamiliar ships outside the station began adjusting their positions, several retreating entirely from the docking ring's outer perimeter, their formation breaking apart as individual vessels made their own separate decisions about whether to remain. Krev Os reached out again shortly after, his voice carrying something closer to relief than the tension of his earlier warning. He told us that Elena Voss's broadcast had reached members of the aggressive faction directly, and that at least 2 of the ships involved had chosen to stand down entirely, rather than risk unilateral action against a coalition now clearly divided over how to proceed. He could not guarantee every threat had fully dissolved, but he confirmed that the immediate danger to the station itself appeared to be passing. I stood beside Elena Voss in the system's core as the tactical displays gradually cleared, one vessel after another withdrawing from the space around Halcyon Drift, until only a handful of coalition ships remained, holding a respectful distance rather than a threatening one. She turned to me once the chamber had grown quiet again, and asked what I intended to do now that the immediate crisis had passed. She reminded me gently that I still held full legal claim over this vessel, and that nothing about tonight's events changed the fact that the decision about its future ultimately rested with me. I thought back to that empty auction hall, to the silence that had filled it the moment the ship's hologram appeared above the stage, to Clara Bishop's warning outside the exit, to Elias Marsh's careful explanation of a war I had known almost nothing about that morning. I thought about the 40 crew members still sealed in stasis somewhere below us, people who had chosen loyalty to a purpose larger than themselves, and about Elena Voss standing here now, awake after 62 years, still carrying that same quiet sense of duty into a galaxy that had changed in ways she was only beginning to understand. I told her I intended to keep the ship, and to keep its crew, not as a weapon waiting for some future war, but as something closer to what she herself had described in that broadcast. A reminder, kept quietly at rest, that strength mattered less than what a person chose to do with it once the fighting was finally over. Elena Voss studied me for a long moment, something that might have been approval settling into her expression, though she said nothing more about it directly. Instead, she simply nodded once, turned back toward the glowing consoles surrounding us, and began the quiet work of bringing the rest of her crew home. I stayed there with her long into that night, watching pod after pod along the stasis deck begin their slow return to consciousness, understanding at last why that auction hall had been so silent the day I raised my hand. Everyone else in that room had known exactly what they were choosing to avoid. I had not known, but standing there now, surrounded by a crew finally waking after 62 years of quiet waiting, I understood completely, and I was not walking away from it.